The call came at 2 in the morning. I was sitting in my recliner, still dressed, watching the news with the volume low the way I always did when sleep wouldn't come. My phone buzzed on the side table, and when I saw it was my twin brother calling, I felt something cold move through my chest before I even answered. We don't call each other at 2 in the morning. We never have. Not in 63 years. I picked up and said his name. He didn't answer right away. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, slow and careful, like a man trying very hard not to fall apart. Then he said, "I don't know what's happening to me. I've spent 28 years as a special agent with the FBI. I've interviewed killers who cried. I've sat across from con artists who could make you believe the sky was green. I know what a person sounds like when they're genuinely afraid versus when they're performing fear. My brother wasn't performing anything. He was terrified, and my brother is one of the most composed men I have ever known. He spent 40 years as a cardiologist. He has held a man's beating heart in his hands. He doesn't rattle easily, so I listened. He told me about the stroke. I already knew about that part, a minor ischemic event 8 months ago, mild left-side weakness that had mostly resolved with physical therapy. What I didn't know was what happened during those first 3 weeks in the hospital and the rehabilitation facility afterward. He had been heavily sedated for the first week. The pain medication alone would have made him sign his name to anything without fully understanding it. And during that window, while my nephew's wife had positioned herself as the devoted caretaker, she had presented my brother with a set of documents. A durable power of attorney, broad, comprehensive, covering financial decisions, property management, healthcare directives. She'd had her own attorney prepare it. She told my brother it was standard paperwork the hospital required. He signed it. By the time he was clear-headed enough to understand what he had signed, she had already transferred signature authority on his primary accounts. She had already changed the billing address on his credit cards. She had already informed his longtime housekeeper, a woman who had worked for him for 14 years, that her services were no longer needed. When my brother tried to access his own savings account online, his login credentials no longer worked. When he called the bank, they told him that per the power of attorney on file, all account inquiries should be directed to his designated agent. His designated agent was my nephew's wife. He told me he had tried to talk to his son about it. My nephew loves his wife deeply, and I don't say that as a criticism. He's a good man. But she had spent months laying a foundation before my brother even had the stroke, telling my nephew small things, quiet things, about how his father seemed forgetful, seemed confused, seemed like he was struggling. So when my brother came to him and said that something felt wrong about the paperwork, my nephew heard it through that filter. He told his father not to stress. He told him that his wife was just trying to help. He told him to rest. My brother had been living in his own 4-bedroom home for 8 months with no independent access to his money. If he needed something, groceries, a prescription, a taxi to a doctor's appointment, he had to ask his daughter-in-law. And when he asked, she might say yes. Or she might say she was busy and she'd get to it. Or she might remind him, in that particular soft voice she had, how much she was already doing for him and how hard this was on everyone. And didn't he think he should be more grateful? He told me she had started serving him dinner at 5:30 in the evening and turning off the internet router in the house at 9 o'clock at night. She told him the signal interfered with her work. He told me she had removed his car from the garage. She said she'd had it serviced. That was 6 weeks ago. By the time he finished talking, it was nearly 3:30 in the morning. I told him to stay on the line. I went to my desk and pulled out a yellow legal pad, and I started writing. I didn't sleep that night. My brother and I are identical. People who know us well can tell us apart. There are small differences, the way there always are. But to someone who doesn't know us closely, we are the same man. Same height, same gray at the temples, same way of holding our shoulders. When we were children, we confused teachers, neighbors, our own relatives. We confused everyone except our mother. And she only because she said she could always tell which one of us was about to cause trouble. That would be me, she always said. She wasn't wrong. I drove to his city 2 days later. I didn't call ahead. I didn't want his daughter-in-law to know I was coming. And I knew that if I called my brother's cell phone, there was a reasonable chance she would see the call. I had already established that she monitored his phone usage. He'd told me as much. I met him at a diner 3 miles from his house. I sat across from him, and I studied his face, and I did not let him see what I was feeling, because what I was feeling was a cold, steady fury that I needed to keep contained if I was going to be useful. There was a bruise on his left forearm, yellowish green, fading but still visible. He told me he'd bumped into a door frame. His hands weren't entirely steady when he lifted his coffee cup. I had brought my laptop. I walked him through the plan, and he listened without interrupting me. That's one of the things I have always loved about my brother. He doesn't flinch. The plan was simple in concept and required precision in execution. I had done more complicated operations with less preparation. We were going to switch places. I would move into his house and live his life. He would stay at a hotel outside the city under my name, credit card, and driver's license. We had done this swap before. Once as teenagers and once on a bed in our 40s, and people had never been the wiser. He would rest and eat well, and I would gather what I needed. What I needed was evidence. Not confrontation, not drama. Evidence. The kind that ends things permanently. He handed me his house keys and his phone, and the reading glasses she had chosen for him. She had picked frames she apparently preferred, even though he told me he hated them, and I handed him my wallet and my car keys and the name of the hotel. We hugged in the parking lot, and he held on for a moment longer than he usually would. I told him I'd call him every evening from a backup phone. He nodded. He thanked me. I told him not to thank me yet. I drove to his house in the late afternoon. She was in the kitchen when I came through the front door, and she looked up from her laptop at the kitchen table with an expression that shifted almost imperceptibly, a quick recalibration, like a person who was momentarily caught off guard and then smoothly recovered. She said, "You're home early," in a pleasant voice that wasn't entirely warm and wasn't entirely cold. It occupied a space specifically designed to be impossible to object to. I said I went for a walk and lost track of time. She said dinner would be at 5:30 and I should wash up. She said it the way you say something to a child. I said that actually, I thought I'd eat around 7 tonight. She stopped typing. She looked at me. Just for a moment, something moved in her expression that wasn't pleasant at all. Then she smiled and said that dinner was already on the stove and it would be overcooked by 7, and she had plans after 6, and it would really be easier for everyone if we just kept to the schedule. I said I understood, and that I hoped her plans went well, and I walked upstairs to my brother's bedroom and closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed, and I breathed slowly for a moment. 28 years of interviews, and I had never encountered a particular kind of manipulation that I found more difficult to articulate than to recognize. It's not cruelty exactly. Cruelty is visible. This was something done with the texture of reasonableness. Everything she said could be defended. Everything she did could be explained. But the cumulative effect, experienced from the inside, landed like a slow pressure applied to the chest. Not enough to break anything, just enough to make it hard to breathe. My brother had been living inside that pressure for 8 months. I ate dinner at 5:30. I did not react. I kept notes on my backup phone that evening in precise, dated entries. I documented the food portions adequate, but calibrated to control, not to nourish. I documented the 9 o'clock router shutdown. I documented the way she came to the doorway of the living room at 8:55 to remind me that she'd be turning off the internet soon, the way you remind someone of a rule they are expected to comply with. I asked her, pleasantly, what the Wi-Fi password was so I could use my phone as a hotspot if I needed to. She said the signal in the house was strong enough that I shouldn't need that. I said I'd still like the password. She said she'd have to look it up and she'd get it to me tomorrow. She did not get it to me tomorrow. On the 3rd day, I asked her about my car. My brother's car. She said it was still at the mechanic. I asked for the mechanic's number. She said she'd written it somewhere and she'd find it. I asked to see the service receipt. She said she thought she'd left it in her other bag. On the 4th day, my brother's attorney, a man I had called from the hotel parking lot before driving to the house, sent her a certified letter requesting a full accounting of all financial transactions conducted under the power of attorney in the previous 8 months, along with supporting documentation. The letter was dry and professional. It was also the kind of letter that, if you had been doing something you shouldn't be doing, would make the floor feel unsteady beneath you. She didn't mention the letter to me, but she was distracted at dinner that evening, and she left her laptop open on the kitchen counter when she took a phone call in the other room. I did not touch her laptop. I am familiar enough with evidence law to know exactly what I can and cannot do without tainting what I find. But I could see the screen from where I was sitting, and what was on the screen was a spreadsheet with column headers and account numbers, and the account numbers did not match the ones I had memorized from my brother's financial documents, which he had provided to me in a folder before we switched. I took a photograph of the screen from across the room with my backup phone. I noted the time, the date, and the circumstances in my log entry that evening. I called my brother from the hotel parking lot the next morning while she was at the gym. I told him what I had found. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I knew it. I knew it wasn't just about being helpful." I told him we were close but not done. I asked him to call my nephew and suggest a family dinner at the house that weekend. Something casual, he should say. He missed seeing his son. My nephew would agree he was genuinely fond of his father, and the distance between them over these months had worn on him, even if he didn't fully understand why it existed. My nephew called her on the way home from work that evening. I was in the living room pretending to read when she took the call in the hallway. I heard her voice change quality in the way that voices do when a person is performing for an audience of one. She was warm and enthusiastic, and said, of course, that sounded wonderful. She would organize everything. She told me at dinner that my nephew was coming for the weekend with a few of their friends, and she was planning a dinner party. And she wanted me to understand that I should let her handle the hosting because she knew how these things needed to go and she didn't want me to overdo it. I said that was fine. I said I was looking forward to seeing my son. She nodded. She seemed satisfied. What she didn't know was that I had made 3 phone calls that afternoon. The first was to my brother's attorney to inform him of the dinner and request his presence. The second was to a woman I had worked with during my time at the bureau who now ran a private financial investigations firm. I asked her to be available by phone Friday evening. The third was to my nephew directly, from the backup phone, identifying myself. That conversation was difficult. He knew my voice as well as his father's. We are twins. But our voices have their own distinctions if you know us well, and he knew us both well. I explained what I had found. I expected resistance. What I got instead was a long silence, and then a sound I had not anticipated, which was my nephew crying. He said, "I kept telling Dad he was confused. I kept saying she was just trying to help. I told him that was by design, that it was not his fault, that the people who do this particular thing are skilled at it." He asked what I needed him to do. I told him. By Friday evening, she had arranged a dinner for 12. Flowers on the table, good wine. The house looked exactly as my brother had kept it for years, beautiful, considered, the product of a lifetime of taste. She had used my brother's accounts to cater the event. I had noted this in my log. My nephew arrived at 6. He embraced me at the door and I held on to him for a moment and he said very quietly, without moving his lips much, "I'm sorry, Uncle." He thought he was speaking to me in my real identity. And he was. But I was also, at that moment, his father, because his father and I are the same man in ways that go beyond the physical, and the apology landed squarely in the right place regardless. Her friends arrived over the next hour. They were pleasant people, most of them, caught in a social situation they didn't understand yet. The attorney arrived and she greeted him with visible tension that she worked very hard to conceal, explaining to the other guests that he was an old family friend. He smiled and nodded and said nothing. At 7:15, I stood up from the dinner table. She started to say something about dessert and I held up one hand, not aggressively, just with the particular quality of stillness that I had learned 28 years ago stops a room. I said, "There's something I'd like to share with everyone." I told them who I was. I watched her face go through a sequence of expressions too fast to track individually. I introduced my nephew's wife to the concept of a durable power of attorney obtained from a medicated man under false pretenses, and to the financial records my brother's attorney had now compiled across 4 months of subpoenaed documents, and to the spreadsheet I had photographed showing a secondary account in her name into which, over the preceding 8 months, a total of $214,000 had been transferred in increments, designed to stay below federal reporting thresholds. That last detail got very quiet. Her friends were not looking at her the way friends look at a person they intend to support. They were looking at her the way people look at something they want to make sure they're not touching. My nephew stood up from his chair and walked to the other side of the table and sat down next to me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The seating arrangement said everything. She said this was a misunderstanding. She said I was making things up. She said my brother was unstable, confused, that everyone knew he'd been struggling since the stroke, that she had records of his erratic behavior, that I had no idea what she had sacrificed. I said that I appreciated her saying all of that on record. I gestured toward the corner of the room near the bookshelf, where a small device had been sitting since Wednesday morning, indistinguishable from the other small decorative objects my brother kept on that shelf. The attorney had reviewed the relevant state statutes on recording consent before I placed it. The expression on her face in that moment is not something I will describe further. Some things don't require elaboration. The police arrived 20 minutes after my nephew's call. The guests were still at the table, mostly. A few had quietly gathered their coats. Nobody's dinner party ends the way they think it will. She was escorted out through the front door with her hands behind her back, past the flowers she had arranged on the entry table, past the art on the walls that she had tried to inventory for insurance purposes 6 weeks prior, a detail I had also noted. My nephew watched from the doorway. He didn't say anything. I don't think he had words for what he was feeling. I drove to the hotel that night and walked into the lobby, and my brother was sitting in the chair near the elevator with his coat still on, waiting. He had been waiting for hours. I had called him when it was over, but he had wanted to wait anyway. He stood up when he saw me, and for a moment neither of us said anything, because there was nothing to say that wasn't already understood. He reached out and straightened the collar of my jacket, his jacket, technically the way he sometimes did when we were younger, an old habit between us. He said, "Was it bad?" I said, "It's over." He nodded. He sat back down. I sat in the chair next to him and we sat there in the lobby for a while, the way we used to sit on the back porch of our parents' house when we were boys, and the day had been long and hard, and there was nothing left to do but let it settle. The legal process took several months. The power of attorney was invalidated by the court on grounds of undue influence and fraudulent misrepresentation. The financial transfers were unwound to the extent possible. Most of the money was recovered, which surprised even the attorney. She was charged with financial elder abuse, fraudulent conveyance, and exploitation of a disabled adult. Her attorney entered a not guilty plea. I testified. 28 years of being believed by juries made me, the attorney told me afterward, what he called a very persuasive witness. My nephew went to individual therapy. He came to his father's house every Sunday for dinner for the rest of that year. He called his father every single day. Some apologies you cannot make in one conversation. You make them over and over, in the accumulation of small, consistent actions, until they become something you no longer need to say out loud. My brother understood this. He never asked his son to apologize again after the first time. He just made room for him at the table. My brother got his car back from the mechanics. Finally, there had never been anything wrong with it. He went back to cooking his own dinners, eating whenever he wanted to, leaving the internet router on until midnight if he felt like it. He told me once that the strangest part of those first weeks after everything was over was the sensation of walking through his own house without calculating how to move through it, without planning what he would say and how it would land, without managing someone else's mood in order to access his own life. He said it felt like putting down something very heavy that you had been carrying for so long you'd forgotten you were carrying it. I understood that. I had carried things like that myself over the years, in a different context, in a different kind of work. I knew what it felt like when the weight finally came off your shoulders, how the absence of it was almost disorienting at first, how you had to learn to stand up straight again. I stayed for 3 weeks after it was over. We had breakfast every morning and walked in the park near his house most evenings. We argued about baseball and about which of us was the better cook, the same argument we had been having since 1978 and would presumably have until one of us couldn't argue anymore. He is wrong, for the record. He has always been wrong. He makes a fine brisket, and he knows I'm right, but he will not concede it. On the day I drove home, he walked me out to my car and stood in the driveway with his hands in his coat pockets, the way our father used to stand. He looked like himself again. Not the man I had found in a diner 3 miles from his own house, holding a coffee cup with unsteady hands. The other version of him, the one I have known my entire life. He said, "Same time next Christmas?" I said, "I'll bring the brisket." He laughed and told me not to embarrass myself. I pulled out of the driveway and watched him in the rearview mirror, standing there in his coat on his own front steps, in his own house, on his own terms. Nobody telling him when to eat or when to sleep or when the lights had to go out. Nobody standing between him and his own life. That image stayed with me the whole drive home. I am not a man who has ever required much. I spent nearly 3 decades doing work that asked a great deal and offered little in the way of visible reward. You learn, in that life, to find satisfaction in the quiet moments rather than the dramatic ones. The arrest, the testimony, the recovery of the money. Those things mattered, but they were not the part I thought about on the long drive back. What I thought about was my brother in that diner, handing me his house keys and his phone with both hands, trusting me with the only thing that can't be replaced once it's gone. Some people come into your life and you would do anything for them. Not because of obligation or history or blood, though all of those things are present, but because they are the person in the world who knows exactly who you are, has always known, and has never once required you to be anything else. My brother is that person for me. He called me that night from his kitchen, eating dinner at 8 o'clock in the evening, the news on in the background, the router on, and the lights up. He said, "I made the brisket." I asked him how it turned out. He said, "Better than yours." I told him that was a lie. He said good night. I sat in my recliner and turned the volume low on the television the way I always do, and I thought that sometimes, when everything has gone wrong for long enough, the only thing required to set it right is one person who refuses to look away. One person who answers the phone at 2 in the morning and picks up a legal pad and starts writing. That's all it takes, sometimes. Just one person who shows up.